Imagine walking through the ruins of Rome, marble glowing in the sun, columns stretching skyward, and realizing every stone is whispering a secret the history books never told you. This is the Rome we are taught to admire. Temples that scraped the heavens, aqueducts that carried life itself, orators whose words still echo in our laws. The empire of order, genius, and eternal glory. The so-called cradle of civilization. But stone has shadows. Behind the columns and rhetoric, Rome engineered a system so precise in its cruelty that it disguised violence as order, oppression as morality, ownership as love. Its laws, praised as timeless, were written not just to govern men, but to control women's bodies, their desires, their futures, even their breath. This was not hidden. It was celebrated, institutionalized, exported across continents as part of Rome's genius. The empire that gave the world aqueducts and philosophy also gave it legalized rape, virginity prisons, and ritualized humiliation. A civilization that wrapped its brutality in ceremony and called it sacred. And once you step behind the mask, once you see the Rome that women lived and died within, you will never look at its marble the same way again. Step past the marble mask, and the descent begins. Rome's genius was its law. Its cruelty was also its law. And nowhere is that clearer than in marriage. To us, marriage suggests companionship, family, maybe even love. In Rome, it was a legal transaction. A woman did not gain a husband. She lost herself. The Romans had a word, manus. It meant hand. But this hand was not gentle, not protective. It was ownership. Once under manus, a wife's identity dissolved into her husband's authority. Her land, her wealth, her very body became his. She could not own, she could not decide, she could not even speak in court. The law folded her like parchment into his ledger, cataloged alongside vineyards, goats, and furniture. Picture a wedding day. The garlands are fresh, the torches lit, the guests singing. A young bride stands at the center, flowers in her hair, eyes bright with hope. To her family, this is celebration. To the law, it is erasure. The moment vows are spoken, she vanishes as a citizen. What remains is property and choice. That too was often an illusion. Fathers decided the legal fate of their daughters, whether to keep them under paternal control or hand them over like a coin across a table. Imagine being passed from one authority to another, not as a person, but as a transaction. The tragedy is that many Roman men did not see this as cruelty. They saw it as order, stability, the foundation of society. To them, a woman's silence was not loss, it was harmony. A wife's obedience was not oppression, it was virtue. But for the women, it was the slow erosion of self. To laugh, to love, to dream, always under the knowledge that the law would never remember them as individuals. This was not one marriage, not one family. It was the architecture of empire. Rome built roads, aqueducts, and monuments, and beneath them all, it built chains disguised as vows. If marriage erased women into property, religion entombed them in silence. No figure reveals this better than the Vestal Virgins, women exalted as holy, yet bound tighter than any prisoner. Chosen as children, often no older than 6, they were taken from their families and sworn to 30 years of service. 30 years. Before they even knew the taste of freedom, their futures were locked away. Their duty? Guard the sacred flame of Vesta, the goddess of the hearth. To Rome, this flame symbolized eternal life. To the girls, it was a shackle. Day after day, they kept vigil, their lives narrowed to a ritual that allowed no error, and error had a punishment more terrifying than death in battle. If the flame went out, the city panicked. But if a Vestal broke her vow of chastity, the punishment was burial alive. Picture the scene. A narrow underground chamber, barely wide enough to stretch out in. Inside, a bed, a jug of water, a loaf of bread. Rome insisted it was not execution, but exile. But once the entrance was sealed, the silence told the truth. The girl would gasp in the darkness until breath became impossible. Above her, the sacred fire blazed on. Below, her body became fuel for the myth of Rome's purity. This cruelty was not hidden. The city watched the procession, saw her led in her white robes to the pit. Her death was spectacle, her suffering transformed into ritual. Rome's message was clear. Purity mattered more than life, obedience more sacred than humanity. And yet, these women were celebrated. They were given seats of honor at games, respected in the streets, treated as symbols of Rome's greatness, elevated yet imprisoned, revered yet disposable. They were marble statues in human form, glittering on the outside, hollowed on the inside. This is how Rome sanctified oppression, by dressing it in ceremony, calling it holy, and convincing its daughters that silence was devotion. From the solemn silence of the Vestals, Rome turned to another weapon of control, the law of infamia. To us, the word suggests scandal. To the Romans, it meant erasure. With this law, a woman's standing in society could vanish overnight. She did not need to commit a crime. Sometimes all it took was a husband's suspicion, a father's anger, or a whisper in the street. With a stroke of ink, she could be branded with infamia, placed among those the state considered dishonorable. And once branded, the consequences were permanent. A woman lost the right to marry with respect. She could not inherit property. She could not testify in court. In the eyes of the law, she remained alive, but as a citizen, she was gone. Imagine the terror of it. To wake one morning a wife, a mother, a daughter of Rome, and to fall asleep that night as someone legally erased. Neighbors turn away, friends fall silent, even family may abandon you. You are still present, but in the eyes of society, you no longer exist. Festivals and public celebrations only deepen this cruelty. During events meant for joy, poorer women or those enslaved could be compelled into roles they did not choose, their bodies turned into symbols of indulgence for others. Consent, individuality, dignity, all dissolved under the weight of expectation and decree. The mark of infamia was not burned on the skin, but it seared just as deeply. It was shame legalized, humiliation made permanent, identity stripped away by law. And if Rome could erase women with a word, it could just as easily destroy them with spectacle. If infamia branded women with shame, slavery stripped them of even the illusion of dignity. For Roman women in chains, the body was not their own, it was currency. The law did not forbid the rape of enslaved women, it assumed it. Masters claimed them as concubines, as party entertainment, as breeding stock. Consent was not absent, it was irrelevant. Ownership extended into flesh. Picture a girl of 12 on the auction block. Her eyes lowered, her voice silenced. No one asks her name. No one asks her dreams. They ask only her price. Her worth is measured not in who she is, but in what can be taken from her. And when she gives birth, the child is not hers either. That child is entered into the ledger as property, born in chains before taking a first step. This was not cruelty by chance. It was cruelty by design. Rome used rape as strategy, turning wombs into factories of empire. Enslaved women were forced to reproduce, not for love, not for family, but to expand the labor force. Children became units of wealth. Mothers became tools of economy. The psychological torment was relentless. Every glance from a master was a threat. Every pregnancy was captivity doubled. Even motherhood, the most intimate bond of all, was twisted into despair. To love a child was to love what the law had already stolen. And Rome laughed. Poets like Martial and Juvenal joked about slave girls in their verses, turning trauma into entertainment. For the wealthy, owning beautiful women was a status symbol, no different than rare animals or exotic art. To them, this was refinement. To the women, it was annihilation of the self. Rome's economy was not built only on conquest and stone. It was built on bodies, on wombs repurposed into instruments of power. And if Rome could turn women's suffering into an economic system, it could just as easily turn their punishment into spectacle, cruelty staged for the roar of the crowd. If branding women with dishonor was not enough, Rome elevated humiliation into public ritual. One of the harshest punishments was damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. At first, it was reserved for criminals, but in time, women accused of betrayal or dishonor could find themselves dragged into the arena. their private lives transformed into public judgment. Imagine the Colosseum, filled with tens of thousands of voices. The air thrums with anticipation, the crowd restless for entertainment. And at the center of the sand stands a woman, stripped of dignity, her hair cut away, her name replaced by accusation. She is no longer a citizen, she is a performance. The gates open, the crowd erupts. What unfolds is not justice, but choreography, cruelty staged as spectacle, suffering consumed as amusement. And even outside the arena, humiliation continued. Women accused of impropriety could be paraded through the streets, forced to endure ridicule while branded with signs that announced their crimes. Their bodies and reputations were made into lessons for others, reminders of what happened when a woman was deemed disobedient. Rome told itself this was morality, order, the protection of honor. But in truth, it was theater of shame, rehearsed, ritualized, repeated. For the women, the torment was not only the punishment itself, but the knowledge that their final moments, or their lifelong disgrace, were consumed as spectacle, leaving them no privacy, even in suffering. The Colosseum now lies in silence, its stones weathered and broken. But if you listen in imagination, the echoes remain. The roar of the crowd, the chants of approval, the silence of those whose stories ended not in justice, but in performance. Rome's obsession with controlling women did not end at marriage or law. It extended into the most intimate parts of life, purity and fertility. A daughter's virginity was not seen as her own, but as her family's property. Families clung to it like treasure, and Rome devised rituals to test it. Strange concoctions of wine and herbs, barefoot walks across fragile eggs, ceremonies where a single stumble could destroy a girl's future. Imagine the terror. To have your worth decided not by who you are, but by the crack of an eggshell. Fertility, too, was weaponized. A woman's body was judged by her ability to produce sons. If pregnancies did not come quickly, blame never fell on the man, only on her. Treatments prescribed by Roman physicians were more ritual than science, more torment than cure. Smoke, cuts, bruises, all inflicted under the guise of healing. The body became a laboratory, and womanhood itself was treated as a defect needing correction. Psychologically, this left no escape. Too pure, and suspicion lurked. Too barren, and disgrace followed. Rome turned biology into judgment, transforming private struggle into public shame. If purity and fertility were cages, widowhood and adultery were snares, sharpened with hypocrisy. When a husband died, his widow's grief was not hers to command. By law, she was forbidden to remarry for 10 months. Not out of respect for her loss, but because men feared her body might still carry the trace of another's seed. Her womb was treated as contaminated property, not as part of her own being. And yet, widowers could remarry immediately, applauded for continuing the family line. Adultery carried even sharper blades. Under Roman law, a husband could kill his wife if he caught her in the act. A father could kill his daughter if he merely suspected her of intimacy outside marriage. No trial, no proof. Suspicion was enough. For men, however, the rules bent. A husband could seek pleasure with enslaved women, courtesans, or those deemed beneath him without consequence. Fidelity was demanded only of wives. Adultery in Rome was not betrayal of love. It was theft of property. Thus women walked in constant fear, grief restricted, love criminalized, survival always hanging on the judgment of men. Rome called this morality. In truth, it was domination dressed as virtue. Rome was an empire of contradictions, and nowhere was this clearer than in how it treated female sexuality. In the home, it was punished. In the temple, it was demanded. Take the cult of Bona Dea, the good goddess. On the surface, its rituals seemed to honor women, shielding them from male presence. But beneath the incense and chants, enslaved women were often compelled into roles that blurred devotion with violation. What in the household was condemned, in the temple was sanctified, exploitation reframed as holiness. Beyond the shrines, the stage became another trap. Actresses, dancers, singers, women who dared to perform in public, were legally branded with the same dishonor as prostitutes. Their art, their voices, their bodies became reasons to strip them of rights. They could captivate thousands with talent, yet were denied respect in the eyes of the law. This was Rome's great theater of contradictions. Female desire, when chosen freely, was shameful. Female desire, when coerced by ritual, was sacred. Female artistry, when expressed openly, was condemned. For women, there was no exit. To refuse was disgrace. To consent was crime. To be forced was holy. In every path, their bodies were claimed not for themselves but for the empire. Rome called this civilization. But what it created was a stage where women's suffering was scripted, rehearsed, and performed as law, ritual, and entertainment. Rome's contradictions did not vanish when its empire crumbled. They lingered, carved into the bones of Western civilization. Rome's laws, admired for their order and precision, carried shadows within them. Shadows that reappeared in medieval codes, in church doctrines, in debates that still echo today over who controls a woman's body. The empire gave the world aqueducts and roads, yes, but it also gave us precedents, that a woman's honor belonged to her family, that marriage was ownership, that fertility was obligation, that sexuality was threat unless tamed by ritual. The most chilling truth is not that Rome was cruel, it is that Rome was normal. These practices were not seen as monstrous excesses. They were celebrated, justified, codified. Civilization did not stand in opposition to brutality, it stood upon it. Consider this: when Europe built its legal systems, it looked to Rome. And what did it inherit? Not only a framework for governance, but a logic of domination. A belief that women were symbols, not selves. That purity and obedience defined virtue. That sexuality could be legislated, punished, or consecrated depending on who held power. Behind every triumphal arch is an unmarked grave. Behind every marble column, a chamber where a girl suffocated in silence. Behind every law admired for its elegance, the memory of a woman erased to make the system function. The echo is not only historical, it is psychological. It teaches us how easy it is to wrap violence in ceremony, to carve cruelty into law, to disguise oppression as civilization. Rome reminds us that greatness and brutality often rise together, carved from the same stone. And though its empire is dust, its shadows remain. Its monuments stand tall, but its ghosts whisper in the cracks, warning us that what is celebrated as order may be nothing more than cruelty and marble. And yet, even in the empire's labyrinth of chains, not every voice was silenced. Rome tried to bury women beneath law, ritual, and spectacle. But silence is never perfect. Whispers survive. Some women resisted openly, bending the rules of power, maneuvering influence through family and politics. Others resisted in quieter ways, through endurance, through memory, through refusing to let the empire erase their humanity. Survival itself became rebellion. Picture a Vestal virgin who emerges after 30 years of service, her youth gone, her freedom finally returned. Her hair is gray, but her eyes are unbroken. Or the enslaved mother who, even knowing her child would be claimed as property, still rocks the infant in her arms, still sings softly into the night, a lullaby the empire cannot own. Or the widow who refuses to remarry when the law allows, choosing solitude not as punishment, but as defiance. These women did not topple Rome's structures, but by surviving within them, they left cracks in its perfection. They are the ghosts who endured, haunting the empire that tried to erase them, haunting history itself. And perhaps this is the lesson Rome leaves us. Empires rise on marble and monuments, but they fall just the same. What endures are the stories of those who lived in spite of cruelty. Their survival is the quiet echo that reaches us through the centuries. Civilization's mask was brilliant, but behind it were voices, silenced yet unyielding, erased yet remembered, ghosts waiting to be heard. And now that we have heard them, we can never look at Rome, or at civilization itself, in the same way again.